January 9, 1945. Somewhere along the frostbitten shoulder of the Ardennes salient, a farmhouse stood half-collapsed beneath the weight of winter and war. The snow had stopped falling 2 hours before dawn. What remained was a silence so absolute it seemed to press against the eardrums, the kind of quiet that comes only when the earth itself is holding its breath. In the cellar of that farmhouse, 6 American artillerymen from Battery C, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, huddled around a field telephone that had gone dead sometime after midnight. Above them, through the splintered beams and shattered masonry, the sky was turning the color of old bruises. They could hear nothing, not the rumble of Allied armor, not the distant percussion of friendly guns. Only the creak of frozen wood and the shallow rhythm of their own breathing. 17 days earlier, the German army had torn through these same forests with a fury the Western Allies had not anticipated. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had been Adolf Hitler's final gamble, a desperate thrust designed to split the Allied front, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans into a separate peace. It was an offensive born not of strategic opportunity, but of ideological refusal. The refusal to accept that the war was lost, that the Reich was collapsing, that the industrial and material supremacy of the United States had already rendered the outcome inevitable. And yet, for 2 weeks in December 1944, it had worked. Entire American divisions had been encircled. Supply lines had been severed. Men had frozen to death in their foxholes. The offensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge had, for a brief and terrible moment, made the unthinkable seem possible. But by early January, the momentum had shifted. The skies had cleared. Allied air power had returned. Patton's Third Army had punched through from the south. And now, across the shattered landscape of eastern Belgium, the German army was no longer advancing. It was holding, desperately, violently, with the kind of fanaticism that comes when retreat is no longer a tactical option but an admission of existential failure. The men in that farmhouse cellar knew none of this in any formal sense. They knew only that they had been cut off from their battery for 36 hours, that their radio was dead, that the Germans were close. Close enough that they could hear, in the pre-dawn stillness, the distant clatter of tracked vehicles moving through the tree line to the east. They were forward observers, trained to call in artillery strikes on enemy positions, but without communication, they were simply 6 men with carbines, a single bazooka, and a growing certainty that they would not see another sunrise. What they did not know, what no one in that farmhouse could have known, was that within the next 4 hours, they would improvise a defense so unlikely, so materially absurd, that it would be documented in after-action reports, studied in post-war tactical reviews, and quietly filed away as one of the 10,000 small miracles that defined the American experience in Europe. They would stop a Panzer IV medium tank with a piece of scrap steel, a tractor axle, and the kind of mechanical ingenuity that had nothing to do with military doctrine and everything to do with the fact that, in 1945, the United States was not just fighting a war, it was exporting an entire industrial philosophy, one that treated improvisation not as desperation, but as a form of applied democracy. The German army, by contrast, had long since stopped improvising. It had stopped adapting. It had become a machine designed to execute orders even when those orders no longer corresponded to reality. And in the cold mathematics of attrition, that difference between rigid doctrine and flexible resourcefulness would prove more decisive than any single battle. The first light came not as dawn, but as a kind of gray leakage, seeping through the shattered walls and turning the snow outside from black to ash. Corporal Daniel Ashford, a farm boy from Iowa who had once rebuilt tractor engines in his father's barn, was the first to hear it. Not the sound itself, but the absence of sound that preceded it. The way the frozen air seemed to contract, as if the landscape itself were flinching. He held up one hand. The other stopped moving. For 10 seconds, there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, the low mechanical growl of a diesel engine, throttling down as it approached the tree line. Ashford moved to the cellar stairs and peered through the broken doorway. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a shallow depression, surrounded on three sides by open fields now buried beneath 2 feet of snow. To the east, perhaps 400 yards distant, a line of skeletal pines marked the boundary of a logging road. The sound was coming from there. He could see nothing yet, but the sound was growing louder, and with it came a second noise, the high metallic squeal of track links under tension, the unmistakable signature of armored movement. Behind him, Private First Class Eugene Cartwright, a gunner from Pennsylvania who had worked in a steel mill before the war, whispered a single word: tank. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat certainty one might use to announce the arrival of a freight train. The men in the cellar did not panic. Panic requires the luxury of alternatives, and they had none. Their position was indefensible. The farmhouse offered no cover against armor. The fields offered no concealment. The nearest American lines were at least 2 miles to the west, and between here and there lay open ground patrolled by German infantry who had, over the past 3 weeks, developed a particular talent for ambushing isolated American units. Sergeant Harold Mitchum, the ranking man, made the decision in less than 5 seconds. They would not run. Running across open snow in daylight would get them killed before they covered 100 yards. They would not surrender. Surrender meant a POW camp, and every man in that cellar had heard the stories coming out of the Malmedy massacre. Stories that, whether exaggerated or not, had fundamentally altered the calculus of risk on the American side. They would fight. And if they were going to fight, they needed something heavier than a bazooka. The bazooka was their only anti-tank weapon. It was a 2.36-inch M9A1 rocket launcher, effective against light armor at close range, marginal against medium tanks, and all but useless against the frontal armor of anything heavier. The problem was not the weapon itself, but the angle of engagement. To penetrate the thinner side or rear armor of a Panzer IV, they would need to wait until the tank was past them, which meant letting it roll directly into their position. And even then, a single hit was no guarantee. Bazooka rounds were notoriously unreliable in freezing temperatures. The propellant could fail, the fuse could freeze, and if the first shot missed, there would be no second chance. Cartwright, the mill worker, was staring at the rusted chassis of an old farm tractor half buried in the snow near the barn. The barn itself had been gutted by shell fire days earlier, leaving only a skeletal frame and a scatter of twisted metal. But the tractor was intact, or at least its frame was. And lying beside it, partially obscured by snow, was a section of steel plating, a piece of the barn's roof perhaps, or part of a grain silo, thick enough that it had not been shredded by shrapnel. It was roughly 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, and maybe a 1/4 inch thick. Heavy, useless for most purposes. But Cartwright was not thinking about most purposes. He was thinking about the way sheet steel bends under pressure, the way it absorbs impact, the way it can, if angled correctly, deflect rather than stop. He turned to Ashford. "You ever rig a plow guard?" Ashford blinked. "What?" "A plow guard, on a tractor, for when you hit rocks." "Yeah, sure. Can you rig that plate onto something we can move?" Ashford looked at the tractor, then at the steel plating, then back at Cartwright. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Maybe." What happened over the next 90 minutes would later be described in the battery's after-action report as unorthodox field engineering under enemy contact. That was the language of official documentation, the bureaucratic shorthand used to describe things that had no proper place in a training manual. The reality was simpler and stranger. 6 men, using hand tools scavenged from a ruined barn and a tractor that had not run since 1943, built a makeshift shield capable of stopping a Panzer round. They worked in silence, moving with the kind of focused urgency that comes when time is not measured in minutes, but in the steadily increasing volume of engine noise from the tree line. Ashford and Cartwright dragged the steel plate to the tractor, using a length of chain to haul it across the snow. The plate was heavier than it looked, and both men were already exhausted, underfed and operating on 2 hours of sleep over the past 48. But the weight of the plate was also its value. Weight meant density. Density meant resistance, and resistance, in the absence of proper armor, was the only thing that might keep them alive. The tractor's front axle was still attached to the chassis, a solid steel bar roughly 4 inches in diameter. Ashford used a pry bar to lever the axle free, then positioned the steel plate vertically against the cellar entrance, angling it at roughly 30 degrees from the horizontal. The idea was not to stop a tank round outright. That would have required armor plate far thicker than anything they had, but to deflect it, to turn a direct hit into a glancing blow, to buy enough time for the bazooka team to get a shot at the tank's flank. Cartwright wedged the axle beneath the plate, bracing it against the cellar wall and packing the base with frozen dirt and loose stone. It was not elegant, it was not stable, but when they tested it by leaning their combined weight against the upper edge, the plate held. It did not shift, it did not collapse. It simply stood there, a vertical slab of scrap steel angled toward the tree line like a medieval shield planted in the earth. Private Russ Keegan, a radio man from Brooklyn who had grown up fixing car engines in his uncle's garage, stared at the contraption for a long moment. Then he laughed, a single, sharp bark of disbelief. "You think that's gonna stop a tank?" Cartwright did not look at him. "No, I think it's gonna make the round go somewhere else." "Where?" "Not into us." It was, in the end, the only answer that mattered. The Panzer IV appeared at 0847 hours, emerging from the tree line like a gray shadow made solid. It was a mid-production model, probably from the 9th Panzer Division, marked with the white tactical crosses that identified it as part of Army Group B. The paint was chipped. The tracks were caked with frozen mud. The long 75mm gun traversed slowly from left to right, scanning the farmhouse and the surrounding fields for signs of movement. Behind it, barely visible through the morning haze, came a second tank, and behind that, the unmistakable silhouette of a Kef 251 half-track carrying infantry. Mitchum, watching from the cellar window, felt his throat tighten. This was not a patrol. This was a probe. A deliberate push into what the Germans believed was an undefended sector. If they took the farmhouse, they would have a clear line of advance to the American rear. If they reported the position as clear, more units would follow. And if they realized that 6 American soldiers were hiding in the cellar with a homemade shield and a single bazooka, they would simply level the building with high explosive rounds and move on. The lead tank slowed as it approached the farmhouse, turret swiveling toward the barn. The commander was visible in the cupola, half exposed, scanning with binoculars. He was close enough now that Mitchum could see the frost on his field coat, the way his breath condensed in the frozen air. The tank stopped. The engine idled. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the turret began to traverse toward the cellar entrance. Ashford, crouched behind the steel plate with the bazooka loaded and armed, did not breathe. The tank was perhaps 60 yards away, close enough that a hit would be lethal, but far enough that the frontal armor was still too thick for the bazooka to penetrate. He needed the tank to move, to turn, to expose its flank. But the tank did not move. It simply sat there, engine rumbling, gun barrel sweeping slowly across the farmhouse like the hand of a clock measuring the last seconds of their lives. Then the gun fired. The sound was not loud, it was beyond loud. It was a physical force, a concussion that seemed to collapse the air itself and replace it with a wall of pressure that hit the cellar like a fist. The round struck the steel plate dead center, exactly where Ashford's head had been 3 seconds earlier. The plate did not stop the round. That was never the plan. Instead, the angled surface caught the projectile at an oblique angle, just enough to alter its trajectory. The round screamed off the plate in a shower of sparks and buried itself in the frozen earth 15 feet behind the farmhouse, where it detonated with a muffled crump that sent a column of black dirt and snow into the air. For a single, suspended moment, no one moved. The tank commander was staring at the farmhouse, clearly confused. The gun had fired, the target should have been destroyed, but the farmhouse was still standing, the cellar was still intact. And now, from the shadow of the ruined barn, a figure was moving. Ashford did not think. Thinking would have meant hesitation, and hesitation would have meant death. He stepped out from behind the plate, shouldered the bazooka, and fired. The rocket motor ignited with a hiss and a rush of backblast that filled the cellar with acrid smoke. The round covered the distance to the tank in less than a second, striking the lower hull just behind the drive sprocket. It was not a kill shot. The armor there was still too thick, but the impact was enough to jam the track, and the explosion sent a spall of molten metal into the engine compartment. Black smoke began pouring from the rear deck. The tank lurched forward, then stopped. The turret hatch flew open. The commander was shouting something in German, his voice high and panicked, and then the crew was bailing out, scrambling across the glacis plate and dropping into the snow. The second tank, seeing the lead vehicle disabled, immediately reversed into the tree line. The half-track followed, and just like that, the advance stopped. The German army in January 1945 was no longer the Wehrmacht of 1940. It was not the mechanized juggernaut that had overrun France in 6 weeks, nor the disciplined war machine that had driven to the gates of Moscow. It was an army held together by ideology, coercion, and the rapidly diminishing hope that some miracle weapon or strategic reversal would change the course of a war that had already been lost. The panzer crews at the Ardennes were still competent. They were still dangerous, but they were also exhausted, undersupplied, and operating under orders that no longer corresponded to the tactical reality on the ground. The Americans, by contrast, were not just better supplied. They were supplied in a way that defied comprehension. Every American infantryman carried more ammunition than his German counterpart. Every American tank had more fuel. Every American field kitchen served more food, and every American soldier, whether he realized it or not, was backed by an industrial base so vast that it could afford to be wasteful. The United States in 1945 was producing one Liberty ship every 42 hours. It was manufacturing 80,000 aircraft a year. It was training replacement troops faster than they could be deployed. And it was doing all of this while still maintaining the highest standard of living in the world. This was not just a material advantage, it was a philosophical one. The American military did not expect its soldiers to die for lack of equipment. It did not expect them to hold a position until annihilation. It expected them to adapt, to improvise, to solve problems with whatever tools were at hand. Because the entire culture they came from was built on the assumption that problems were solvable, that systems could be fixed, that the world was not a zero-sum game where survival required the destruction of everyone else. The steel plate that stopped the Panzer round was not a product of military engineering. It was a product of a society that valued mechanical literacy, that taught its children to fix engines and weld metal, that assumed the average citizen could read a blueprint and operate a lathe. It was the same philosophy that turned housewives into riveters, farmers into tank drivers, and factory workers into aircraft mechanics. It was democracy expressed not as a political abstraction, but as a set of practical skills distributed across an entire population. The Germans had never understood this. They had built an army based on the assumption that war was the province of professionals, that discipline and doctrine would overcome material disadvantage, that willpower alone could substitute for industrial capacity. And now, in the frozen fields of Belgium, that assumption was being tested against a group of 6 American artillerymen who had stopped a tank with a piece of scrap steel and a tractor axle. By mid-morning, the farmhouse was no longer isolated. An American patrol from the 7th Armored Division had arrived, followed by a platoon of infantry and a pair of M4 Sherman tanks. The German probe had been repulsed, the line was stabilized, and the 6 men from Battery C were pulled back to their unit where they were debriefed, given hot coffee and K-rations, and told to write up an incident report. Ashford wrote 3 sentences. Cartwright wrote 5. Mitchum, who had a more bureaucratic turn of mind, wrote half a page. The report was filed with the battery commander, who forwarded it to division, who filed it with the after-action summary for the Ardennes campaign. It was never classified. It was never celebrated. It simply became part of the vast administrative record of the war, one more data point in a conflict that generated so much documentation that most of it would never be read. But the steel plate remained. It stayed there, propped against the cellar entrance for another 2 weeks until the farmhouse was finally abandoned. Engineers passing through took photographs. Somebody spray-painted "Iowa Special" on the side in white stencil. And then, when the front moved east and the farmhouse was no longer tactically relevant, the plate was left behind. It is likely still there, rusting into the Belgian soil, unnoticed and unmourned. The symbolic weight of that plate, however, extended far beyond its physical presence. It was steel, the same material that built the skyscrapers of New York, the bridges of San Francisco, the factories of Detroit. It was scrap, discarded and forgotten, repurposed into something that saved lives. And it was American in the most fundamental sense, not because of where it was made, but because of what it represented. The belief that nothing is ever truly useless, that every problem has a solution, that survival is not a matter of fate, but of ingenuity. The German soldier, by 1945, no longer believed this. He believed in orders. He believed in duty. He believed, perhaps, in some abstract vision of the fatherland. But he did not believe that a broken tractor and a piece of scrap steel could stop a tank. That kind of belief required a different worldview entirely, one in which the individual was not a cog in a machine, but a thinking, adapting, problem-solving agent capable of altering his own fate. This was the ideological divide that no amount of doctrine could bridge. The Germans had better tanks. They had better tactics. They had, in many cases, better soldiers. But they did not have better citizens. And in a total war, where every farmhouse was a potential fortress and every mechanic a potential engineer, that difference was insurmountable. The Ardennes offensive ended on January 25, 1945. The German army had lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and the last reserves of fuel and ammunition that might have been used to defend the Rhine. The Americans had lost 19,000 killed, but they had also demonstrated something that no military statistic could capture: the ability to absorb catastrophic losses, adapt under pressure, and continue fighting with undiminished industrial support. Within 2 months, American and British forces would cross the Rhine. Within 4 months, Berlin would fall. And within 6 months, the war in Europe would be over. The men from Battery C did not participate in the final push. Ashford was wounded by shrapnel near the Ruhr River and evacuated to England. Cartwright developed frostbite severe enough that he lost 3 toes and was sent home. Mitchum stayed with the unit until the end, crossing into Germany in March and reaching the Elbe River in April, where he met Soviet troops advancing from the east. He never spoke publicly about the farmhouse or the steel plate. In his letters home, he mentioned it once, in passing, as the time we stopped a tank with junk. But the story persisted. It appeared in regimental histories. It was mentioned in oral history interviews conducted decades later. And it became, in a quiet and unassuming way, one of the 1,000 small legends that defined the American experience in World War II. Not the grand battles or the famous generals, but the improvised solutions, the unlikely survivals, the moments when ordinary men did extraordinary things because they had no other choice. There is a photograph, taken sometime in late January 1945, that shows the steel plate still standing against the cellar entrance. The snow around it is trampled and gray. The farmhouse behind it is little more than a shell. But the plate itself is intact, and in the center, clearly visible, even in the grainy black and white image, is a deep gouge where the Panzer round struck and deflected. It is not a beautiful photograph. It is not dramatic. It is simply a record of something that happened, captured by a Signal Corps photographer whose name was never recorded. But it is also a document of transformation, the transformation of scrap into armor, of desperation into ingenuity, of 6 isolated men into a symbol of something larger than themselves. The German soldiers who abandoned that Panzer IV did not know they were fighting against an entire industrial civilization. They thought they were fighting against 6 Americans with a bazooka. But in truth, they were fighting against every factory in Detroit, every steel mill in Pittsburgh, every farm in Iowa where a boy learned to weld before he learned to shave. They were fighting against a nation that had turned its entire economy into a weapon, not through coercion or ideology, but through the simple democratic principle that every citizen had value, that every skill mattered, that the guy who fixed tractors in peacetime could save lives in war. This was not the narrative the Germans had been taught. They had been told that the Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sustained sacrifice. They had been told that the war would be won through superior will, superior discipline, superior racial destiny. And yet, here in the frozen fields of Belgium, they had been stopped by a piece of scrap steel and the kind of mechanical improvisation that came not from military training, but from a lifetime of living in a society that valued practical knowledge over rigid doctrine. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze the Battle of the Bulge in exhaustive detail. They would study the strategic decisions, the logistical challenges, the tactical mistakes. They would debate whether the offensive had ever had a realistic chance of success, whether Hitler's gamble was rational or delusional, whether the Americans had been caught off guard or had simply chosen to trade space for time. But very few would write about the steel plate at the farmhouse, because it did not fit neatly into any of those narratives. It was too small, too incidental, too absurdly improvised to seem historically significant. And yet, in its own way, it was more significant than any of the grand strategic analyses, because it represented something that no amount of planning or doctrine could replicate: the ability of ordinary people to solve impossible problems with whatever materials were at hand. This was not heroism in the traditional sense. It was not a charge up a hill or a last stand against overwhelming odds. It was simply 6 men, cold and tired and scared, who looked at a broken tractor and a piece of scrap steel and saw a way to survive. That impulse, the impulse to improvise, to adapt, to refuse to accept that a problem is unsolvable, was as American as anything in the war. It was the same impulse that had built the Transcontinental Railroad, that had wired the continent for electricity, that had put a man on the moon. And it was the same impulse that, in January 1945, turned a rusted piece of barn siding into a shield capable of deflecting a Panzer round. The snow began to fall again as the sun set on January 9, 1945. By morning, the farmhouse would be buried beneath another 6 inches, and the tracks of the Panzer IV would be erased as if they had never existed. The war would continue for another 4 months, grinding eastward across Germany until the Reich collapsed into rubble and ash. Millions more would die. Cities would burn. And in the end, the Allies would stand victorious, not because they were braver or more willing to sacrifice, but because they had built a system that could absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting with undiminished strength. But on that night, in that farmhouse, 6 men sat around a fire built from broken furniture and listened to the wind howl through the shattered walls. They did not talk about what had happened. They did not celebrate. They simply ate their rations, cleaned their weapons, and tried to stay warm. And somewhere outside, half buried in the snow, the steel plate stood silent and unmoved, a monument to the kind of small, unnoticed miracles that win wars. It was not the tanks or the planes or the grand strategies that defined the American way of war. It was the willingness to believe that even scrap steel could be turned into something useful, that even a lost farmhouse could become a fortress, that even 6 men with no chance of survival could find a way to live. That belief, practical, unsentimental, rooted not in ideology but in the simple conviction that problems exist to be solved, was the real weapon. And no amount of German discipline or fanaticism could stand against it. In the end, the war was not won by those who were willing to die for their beliefs, but by those who were determined to live for theirs. And sometimes, that determination took the form of a tractor axle, a piece of scrap steel, and the refusal to accept that survival was impossible. It was not glorious, it was not cinematic, but it was, in the truest sense, the American way of war: improvised, practical, and utterly unwilling to give up. The snow continued to fall, and the night grew colder, and the war ground on. But the steel plate remained, angled toward the tree line, waiting for a dawn that had already come and gone.